Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. My name is Professor Matt Freeman, I'm the Centre Director at Supersmith. Today we're joined by a new co-host. Mark, who are you?
Mark Corderoy, I'm the entrepreneur in residence for the university and I run the incubators within the enterprise zone we have here.
So welcome to Innovate Together, the podcast. We are the podcast coming out of the University Enterprise Zone at the University of the West of England. As always, we're interested in graduate startups, university scale-ups, everything in between. Today's theme is really around culture within business, particularly culture in terms of scaling businesses. So delighted to be joined by three speakers who are going to all sort of come at this from inclusion perspectives, B-Corp perspectives, culture, all sorts of approaches, thinking really about people and culture at times of growth. So first of all, let's just do some introductions, if that's all right. So Alicia, over to you.
Hi, so I'm Alicia Grimes. I'm co-founder of The Future Kind.
And I'm Andy Hawkins from Business on Purpose, and I'm a B-Corp coach.
And Emily.
Yep, I'm Emily Morgan. I am co-founder and COO of Supersmith.
Amazing, welcome. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm interested in sort of helping companies grow is recognising points of jeopardy. And the very first point of jeopardy is when companies don't have that right product solution market fit, and too many products are launched when there's no market or no customer for it. But I think the bit about the journey that an awful lot of companies forget about is the challenge of scaling. And I don't think they plan well enough for scaling, and they don't sort of factor that in. The prize for them is getting the investment in or getting the money that enables them to scale. And you see it time and time again, they come back and they almost sit down and think, what next? And they haven't actually used the 3 to 6 months they've been trying to raise money to think, what do I do after it? So I'd be interested in knowing, how you change that culture with companies, because they're so focused on investment, and recruit the wrong person or the wrong team or the wrong structure can be a death sentence for a lot of startups.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you're talking there about the focus that founders have on product market fit and raising funding. And after that tipping point, typically what happens is they bring in those first team members, and actually all that time they were spending on the product and getting investment, they actually spend over 50% of their time managing and looking after teams and these new people. And that's often because they have had a way of working as a small team. As they were going through that process, they were working at pace, they were focused on the product. Of course, that's what you have to do in those initial stages. But what tends to be forgotten is the systems and structures that are evolving quite naturally as that happens, of how you work, how you get stuff done. And that is inevitably your culture. And that means that then when you do have product market fit and you have that new team, you introduce all these new people, but the way you do things is no longer a feeling, it's actually something that you need to have a framework and a structure around, or a system as we like to talk about it, that everyone knows this is how we behave, this is why we exist, this is what we're trying to achieve, this is how we deliver. These are our roles and responsibilities, as much as you can in a small team that has to flex. And we know how we communicate, collaborate, and how we get stuff done, basically. And because often founders and companies are so busy on that product market fit first and foremost, we get it, but how do you then make sure that at that tipping point you then don't end up with just continually having to manage people, and you use that magic that you had when you were first starting out?
I think there's an element as well of recognising the culture of the people you're bringing in.
Yeah.
So often you see founders say, I want to bring in someone who's been country manager for Facebook or something like, they think by bringing someone with the brand behind them, and they don't realise they're bringing someone who's used to maybe a corporate infrastructure that supports their role, and they're moving into a startup where they are the corporate infrastructure for that role as well as delivering it. And that can be a cultural clash for the incoming person to have to be bridged.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is that fixation on a role and a role title, because they'll fix everything and sort everything out. We actually see the magic in generalists as well. That's really important, and that was definitely important for me in my first startup and scale-up roles. And I think that when you have those people coming in, they have to be ready to have that flexibility and also co-create what that system and that culture looks like, because it can't be just at that top-down approach. It has to also be reviewed, reflected and inputted on by new people starting at every stage, because they have to be brought into that culture, because that's the thing that's going to be driving you forward in those long days and as you're kind of trying to get that product out the door and get new customers.
I was just going to say, one of those ongoing things, and we're recruiting at the moment, is skills versus attitudes, because especially when you're a small team, to your generalist point, people are going to have an attitude that they are going to do a bit of everything. So if you get your corporate person in who's used to having an HR function to book their train ticket because they've got to go to X, Y, and Z, it's not really going to work. So do you want somebody who's got a bit less experience, but the attitude and the enthusiasm will see them through? So it's there's no answer to that, but I think that's about a kind of we were talking about the values fit earlier and the attitude, and that is important.
Well, I think it's just being able to recognise that that's an issue is part of the battles in some
being able to
respects.
solve the problem.
It's not just about saying this is the written job description and that's all that matters, and I'm going to tick up someone off on that one.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe it would be helpful to have a disclaimer at the bottom of any startup job description. This isn't actually going to be, what it might seem because
jobs can pivot as well as products. Or something.
Exactly. And that's part of the joy and excitement of startups, right? And I think that's why I've always been so drawn to them and loved working them, because the skill sets not only that you can bring but also learn are incredible, and that learning opportunity is what that is about, that startup in that startup space. I think that how you then make sure that opportunity to still learn and grow goes beyond when you have 20 people onwards, then you might need to think about the structure around that, because that can quickly change from being like, oh, I can be involved in everything, to actually, oh, now I've got a more specific role and I'm accountable for this. And I think that's where we see that evolution change, and we have to think about how job descriptions, organisational structures work at different stages of growth.
It really struck me in the breakfast this morning. You were talking about this stat, this horrifying stat of 58% of employees trust a stranger more than their line manager. So, I mean, Emily, just to switch this over to yourself, as a startup kind of base here within the incubator at UWE, what's kind of been your experience, or maybe your approach, in terms of building your culture within the company? This balance between focusing on the products but then focusing on the team. And I know you talk a lot about kind of inclusion design and these sorts of approaches. So how have you gone about balancing this?
There's lots of different facets to that. So as a product, our purpose is to have an inclusive product that enables people who otherwise wouldn't get out of the house to be included in society, essentially, because they can then leave their house. How does that then play out? I think, I'd like to think we are creating a kind of caring culture to our operations, looking out for each other, making sure that our well-being is, at the forefront, because a bit like if you're at school, happy children learn, right? If you're a happy employer, you're going to do well. And so we've got some small little policies that we've put in place, and I think it relates back to my point around the breakfast, the tiny habits. So making sure that there's little things, so having a coffee with somebody, having a thank you at the end of the week for people that are within the team, those kind of things play out.
I mean, I think what would be kind of really interesting to hear about is obviously when you joined kind of Launch Space during that early stage to now where you are now, what's changed in terms of your attitudes towards the culture of the business?
Oh, that's interesting, because I think when we joined, we were actually next door,
right.
In an area that doesn't exist anymore, and ultimately it was Fred. Archie joined soon after, and it was me working remotely but coming in kind of once or twice, so that kind of dipping in and out. We didn't have any formal meetings. We have now gone to essentially 6 of us, working largely remotely, and I think that would be an interesting topic to explore later, but with Fred and Archie based in the incubator. And we have stand-up meetings every day at 9:30, things are bookended, we've got more processes in place. So we're putting in a structure, but around what I'd like to think was the kind of seed of purpose and inclusivity and community. So it's very much still there, but we're putting, because we need to, a bit more structure. We all have to check in, so there's a reason why we have a call at 9:30 in the morning.
But we were speaking this morning, weren't we, in terms of as a growing startup, and then obviously part of this is going to be talent and recruiting different people to the company. How you then go about not just communicating this culture internally within your own team, but actually how you go about communicating this message to everybody else, so that Supersmith becomes associated with some of these principles as well. So how have you kind of gone about doing that in terms of really sort of shouting about this?
Well, we work with a really cool agency called toward. They're based in Cardiff, and we had a great day. It was really encouraging because at the very beginning we worked with them to kind of set out actually who we are, what's our purpose, what are our mission, what are our values, and from then that falls out all of our marketing communication methods. And I think you touched on this before as well, Alicia, which was the kind of customer acquisition, the message that you're telling your customers, which if it is implicit in your organisation, it then needs to be explicit to them. And so we look at the language that we use. We don't want to talk down to people. It's like we're also very keen to have them on our journey, which both metaphorically and physically, because they know far more about this than we do. Fortunately, we're all able to walk well. There will be a time, however, because there's a flip side of this, which we just happen to be able to walk well now, but actually the majority, that if you assume that nobody can walk well for a temporary period, we are walking well. We'll all need these scooters at some point, and so learning from people that are using them or would like to use them in a different way is really important. And so our communication around that is very important too.
That's fantastic. We'll be right back after this.
In biotech, there is no equivalent of a 3D printer for growing cells.
We give robots the ability to smell, just like humans.
Bad tires that fail cause up to 20% of road accidents.
We know that Bristol is really a city of excellence in terms of tech innovation.
What we're creating is a simple and accessible way to be able to scalably grow cells. And that's obviously important in discovering drugs, but increasingly it's becoming important to be able to diagnose diseases correctly or grow cells for cell therapies and things like that.
So a really good use case for our technology is that we can detect food ripeness. So current technology can only see when it's going off, we can smell it.
The culture of future space is, I think, so important to our ambitions, but really what we want to hear from are people that are looking to perform the most experimental, cutting-edge research and development, something which we can facilitate through the university.
Welcome back, everyone. We are still here in Launch Space, UWE's incubator for high-tech businesses.
Andy, what I wanted to sort of expand the conversation a little bit, the benefits of getting a business accredited, whether it's B-Corp or ISO. In the past, I've found, from a cultural point of view, it's been really useful because one of the unexpected consequences, people suddenly realised they had to start maybe codifying how to do things. If you're a software company and a bug comes in, what is the process of handling that bug? But that was very much an ISO type approach as opposed to a B Corp type approach. So I'm interested in some of the value and some of the processes that you've uncovered or discovered as you've put companies through these sort of processes, and the benefits those organisations have seen from it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I get quite a few clients who've got ISO 14001, for example, and they say, what's the difference between that and B Corp? So one of the most fundamental things is I say ISO feels a little bit like you're answering from your head, whereas B Corp feels like you're answering from your heart much more. It's much more about culture and your gut and who you are and your why, as opposed to this is what we do. A whole bunch of my clients are larger clients. I've worked with a couple of FTSE 500, so big end clients, but it works right the way down through. So for smaller clients, we run them through the program, which we call a 10-step couch to 5K. People kind of understand that, they get that. And then for smaller clients, we work with them on a cohort basis, which we lovingly call our park run approach. And the nice thing about a park run, if you've ever done it, is, no one's particularly fit. It's just a bunch of people having a bit of a run around the park, having a chat, but each week we encourage each other to get fitter. And I think that analogy on the B Corp journey, especially with the cohorts, is a really great analogy of everyone is encouraging each other to be accountable and gradually get fitter.
I love that analogy. We use something similar when people get their first investment check in and they think we've made it. But no, you've just done your first park run. Yeah. You've still got a 5K, 10K, half marathon, and a full marathon to go. It's interesting to see when companies start these processes. You get some companies who leave it too late?
Yeah.
I mean, when do you think is the best time to start? Well, like the cultural thing or the B-Corp thing, is it when you've got 2 or 3 founders, or is there a certain threshold where wait till you've got 10 people or something like that?
My definite response to that is now. Without a shadow of a doubt. There's never a time that is too early. So over the last few years, I've helped over 400 clients, some at the big end, well established, but 6 of my clients have been pre-startup.
Right.
So you might think, well, is that too soon? And they've said, well, should we trade for a year? And then after a year, we'll come back and go through the B-Corp program then. And they obviously can, there's no issues with that. But we talk to them about what issues we'll cover during the actual program, things about getting some of those foundations in properly from the get-go. And if you're able to design that into your process and your culture from the very beginning, it's a whole lot easier than reverse engineering. So we would genuinely say now is the time to do it.
I think growing with it is definitely the right approach. I've seen with things like quality standards where people are trying to deploy 0 defects and someone said, but 0 defects is impossible. And they say, okay, we'll have a 2 defect policy and we'll create a committee that will decide which defect will we put in if we've only got 1 defect or something like that. So this idea of, it is the culture if you start very, very early on, and it becomes that guiding principle for hopefully all the decisions you have to make as you grow.
Yeah, and I think also with a new company, they are clearly not quite sure about how to do this stuff. They know in their heart that this is something they want to do, but they're not quite sure. And then in the same way that you've got a Couch to 5K that kind of takes you through the journey in bite-sized chunks, we find going through this 10-step program in bite-sized chunks each week, 2 hours a week for 3 months. So it's not something that's going to distract people from their normal day job. That is possible. But doing through it in a programmatic type way, a systematic type way, is a way that enables them to inculcate it within their culture. And by going through the journey, it gives them a platform to discuss it with their colleagues, with their other stakeholders, suppliers, clients, and it gives them a framework around which to discuss some of these issues. And in the process of doing it, it makes sure that everybody's voice gets heard, not just the founder who speaks the loudest or they are the top of the tree, but that everyone in the stakeholder ecosystem gets a voice as to what they think that good thing could be. And so having that inclusive environment to build your platforms, your foundations and values on which everything else is then built, whether you're then scaling from 20 to 200, because you've got those platforms and foundational values in place, it makes growing without sacrificing your culture and your values much easier. So we found that programmatic way is a really good how-to guide for any business to go through.
Are there different challenges depending upon the sector that you operate in? So, traditionally a lot of the high-tech startups are software companies, SaaS type software, but we've got hardware companies in the incubator, you've got biotech companies, but then at the other end of the spectrum you've got transactional companies, PR companies, design agencies. Does the sector make a big difference?
It does to a certain extent. So we certainly find that smaller companies think it's easier for a big company to get B Corp because they've got more processes and policies in place, but they are less nimble to change those decisions, whereas the smaller companies are generally devoid of process and policy, but are very nimble to just make a decision. We've chatted about that. That's what we're going to do. Here we are. Here's the process in place. So it's different between big and small. There's also a difference between product and service oriented companies, not so much in terms of the process, but just some of the impactful business models that they might deploy, for which they will be rewarded and encouraged to go down a more impactful business model in terms of what their product might deliver or what their service might deliver.
I suppose all those issues of the supply chain are very different between the different types of businesses.
Yeah. But even though the supply chain between product and service is different, supply chain is important. And especially if you're trying to grow impact and grow a good business, a values-led business, trying to push that down through your supply chain is a really great way of increasing impact. One company can provide impact of 1x, but if you push that through your supply chain, you can deliver 10x, and that's ultimately what we're trying to work towards.
And it makes me think, Alicia, as well, just thinking, these questions of scaling and starting early and embedding in. Obviously, you talk about sort of a company kind of operating system. Something that me and Mark were kind of speaking about off air was how often do you review them? So there's one question around when you start, and then when you scale, when you're going to look at it again. But what do you advise companies in terms of not just embedding these kind of processes and principles, but actually how often you review them and revise them as that kind of scaling is taking place?
Yeah, well, I agreed with a lot of what Andy was saying there around, starting as early as you can, because that makes it easier. But there's a reality that comes with that as well. Like to that earlier point of finding product market fit, getting that investment, it takes time. And so I think in terms of how regularly you should be looking at it, it's more about how do you set up those rituals or routines or rhythms as an organisation to constantly have a temperature check. So typical organisations have an ENPS score, so that's your employee survey. You might have your customer surveys that go out as well. They're classic data points. But something we do alongside embedding a company operating system is we also work with teams to take a design thinking, service design mindset and a product-led mindset to how you design your people experiences. And the reason we do that is because it means that you're constantly keeping ahead of those problems to solve, your people needs, but also you're aligning it with your business goals. So it should become a mindset that's part of this. And then, like you would with any product, you should have regular check-ins and feedback loops that your team are getting together to discuss this and what that looks like. So you might get your data from your ENPS score and say, okay, we've got a bit of a wobble here, let's get together as a team. But how do you make sure you've continuously got your finger on the pulse? And there's ways of doing that through your leadership team rituals and saying that every monthly meetup, we will have a discussion purely about our team culture and how that's tracking. And we'll look across the company operating system and we'll do a quick voting scheme of where are we, 1 to 5, how strong are we feeling in each of these different areas? And actually bringing to the floor any of those issues that need to be discussed, because ultimately, you should have 90-day strategic goals that are feeding into a 1-year plan and your wider strategy. You need to be able to identify those issues on a monthly, perhaps fortnightly basis and continuously keep a view on that, because otherwise, if you sort of say each year we'll look at our company operating system, in the types of company we work with, so much can change there and people may have left, new people have joined. So for me, you have to build it into those rhythms and rituals and have those specific data points to check in on as well.
I think being able to align it maybe with the actual business objectives. So if your business objective is to do a funding round in October or a product launch in December, those are two big milestones which should be where the whole company is focused, because you want to make sure that everyone is focused on the things that are most important within that company.
Exactly, and that's why part of the operating system is around metrics of success and everyone knowing what metric they own, what they're accountable for, and then being able to say, oh, people at that team are smashing it, they've really hit those goals. This one, not so much. Why is that happening? And actually being able to look into that. But we often think that culture can't be attached to metrics because it is complex. It's very hard. A lot of it can feel intangible. The idea is with a company operating system, you should be able to directly align it with your business strategy, because ultimately your culture is what puts your strategy into practice.
I was just going to say, you mentioned about temperature checks, and I think there's from some of the examples that you're talking about, it feels like surveys and more kind of grand scales of things would be associated with businesses of kind of 50 plus, and therefore if you're a group of kind of 5 to 10 people, doing a survey feels a bit laborious. But I think actually just a takeaway from me would be we're only kind of 6 people at the moment. That shouldn't stop us doing a monthly temperature check, because actually I'm of the belief that surely if there's a problem somebody would raise it, because we're all having communications, isn't that kind of good and open? But I think that putting down our metrics like that then actually gives the relative points and something to refer back to as we look back over time and look at our milestones of whether that's an investment or a product launch. So no matter how big we are, we should be doing something around measurement.
Exactly, and I think, because my background is in service design, design thinking, I won't geek out too much about this, but surveys is one component, and we talk about data triangulation all the time. There should be 3 other points of data that you're one-to-ones, group meetings where you're actually hearing more about what's going on in the organisation. And to your point, we can make assumptions that we know what's going on, but so much can be going on behind the scenes and what that looks like. So it's about how we build that in to know and understand what's happening.
I think to sort of draw this a little bit to a close, picking up on this interesting thing of uncertainty, a question that's sort of come forward from the breakfast this morning is around remote working. So, you're thinking post-COVID, all of the shifts, we could argue that actually since COVID, more and more people are going back into the office. It seems to be quite sector-driven at the minute in terms of actually whether people are in 5 days, whether people are remote, whether people are hybrids, how that's kind of currently working. But it'd be great to hear just very briefly from each of you, if that's all right, around kind of advice or strategies or experiences you've got in terms of advising companies or maybe even yourselves in terms of how you go about putting all of this stuff that we've spoken about into practice in the context of remote working. So Emily, what's been your experience of this?
Well, I essentially work remotely, so I'm in Bristol maybe once every 2 weeks. And I think what is really important is the communications, and we are a small team. We don't get many water cooler moments, which I think are invaluable. And a kind of way of supporting that in some ways is that every day we have a call where we all join at 9:30. And it kind of starts with an AOB and a check-in on how we're doing, and there's 10 minutes allowed for that, and then actually we start with, we'll kick into an agenda. I think actually it's given me a point of reflection where we're probably squeezing out those first 10 minutes, and so action for tomorrow is to discuss the AOB and the check-in before we kind of squeeze the agenda slightly. What's been invaluable is having the space at the hardware incubator, because it means that we can do things we otherwise wouldn't have done. We started sort of towards the end of the pandemic, testing our mobility scooter, mostly with Fred's housemates, which were a huge benefit. But then having the space here has made all the difference. And we've really noticed, for example, with the benefit that we had from the UWE internship scheme, that when people are remote, you don't learn as quickly. You just aren't around that implicit knowledge. And so the other angle that we're trying to do is, as well as kind of regular check-ins, whether that's online, but more importantly, team building events, and actually making sure that we are all on the same place for a period of time to kind of come together, readjust, reassess, reset, and then move on together.
Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I don't know if I do think that the comeback to work is necessarily sector specific in terms of this sector isn't. I think the experience that I've seen is it's more down to the founder and the management team, and that it depends how confident or secure they are in their team and the trust that they've got in their team. So that's something that I've seen amongst the hundreds of companies that I've worked with, the vast majority of whom do have people working from home. So that's been an interesting thing, and is, as soon as we hear people saying we are insisting on you coming back, that's a little bit of a red flag of is there an issue with the culture there, and is there another way of actually addressing that, or at least opening that lid up to check that. So that's been one piece of learning. Again, we found that with the B-Corp framework, in terms of how often you measure, we would generally say, a lot of it needs to be measured regularly, but certainly once a year in terms of those formal points. And because of those regular check-ins, we will be able to get that communication back. And because of the whole emphasis on multi-stakeholder engagement, it gives people a feeling that their voice matters. It's not just I have to obey from what comes down from on high, but that my voice matters, and therefore that opens up the channels of communication more. But people working from home, that is now pretty much business as usual, and we just need to embrace it. There's pros and cons to it, so let's make the most of it and try and facilitate the benefits that it brings, and then identify where those challenges are and put some processes in place, like those virtual water cooler moments, to just make sure we minimise that and close those gaps. But there's lots of different things that can be done. One of the things we find is that on the B-Corp journey, employees are encouraged to do volunteer days. So you can use those volunteer days as those water cooler days, and not only benefit from those water cooler, more relaxed moments while you're doing volunteer work together, but you can then also incorporate learning and development into those volunteer days as well. So there's a whole little range of things that you can make the volunteer day. You know, I'm just going out, is this a bit of a waste of time? You can make it really good team building, really good learning and development, really good reflection points, and is where a lot of the real heart-to-heart communications take place, because you're not just head down at the screen writing code for the next 3 hours, but you've actually got some space to communicate and be a human. So there's lots of those learning points that we've found have been really useful on that journey.
I think that point there, across both of your points, is there's an intentionality to it as well, and what remote work requires, and is so important because it means we have a more inclusive, diverse workforce, whether it's remote, hybrid, it's the intentionality around it. So we always talk about design your culture with the same intentionality you would be if you're remote, because if you are a remote team, you have to be very clear on how we do things around here, how we communicate, how we learn, how we collaborate, and you have to really think about where's the opportunity and need here and what are we addressing with each of these things, and then document it as well. We often forget to document how we do things around here and put it in a place that's as part of people's onboarding, it's part of their team check-ins, it's easily accessible, and we have so much technology available to us now. We can have nudges to remind people, hey, it's today's check-in, let each other know how you're doing. It's, you know, the opportunity is endless, but you have to have that intentional view and take on it, and it takes time, it takes effort, and I think some people will shy away from that, and they'll think that trust comes from being in the same space with each other, that information passing across comes from being in that same space. It's actually more about that intentionality and that time and effort to design your operating system and how you get stuff done, and I think that's really core, how people can be focused and be more intentional about it.
Alright guys, that is the end of this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, you can find us on any major podcasting platform online. If you're currently watching this on YouTube, please remember to subscribe and give us a thumbs up. If you need more information about FutureSpace or Launch Space, just do a Google search, FutureSpace Bristol or Launch Space UWE, and I'm sure you'll find us. Looking forward to the next one. See you soon. Welcome to Launch Space, the place where ideas come to life. We are the university's incubator, nestled in the University Enterprise Zone. Ready to turn your idea into a reality? Whether you're thinking of starting a business or testing a new concept, we're here to help you grow. Join the ranks of over 200 startups we've supported, helping them raise over 150 million. So, what are you waiting for? See you soon.